If you've ever felt confused when it comes to breathing for singing, or no matter how much you work on your breathing as it relates to singing, it just seems to get worse and worse, I want you to know that you're not alone. If you're new to this channel, my name is Veronica Kokos. I am a holistic voice teacher who believes that there are no wrong notes when it comes to singing, only curiosity, compassion, and play. Let's talk about breathing for singing. I feel like breathing is one of those over-instructed and under-explained parts of singing. It seems like every teacher and every singer has a different definition of how we should breathe when it comes to singing. I know a lot of us singers and teachers have heard things like, you just need to add more breath support, or you need to breathe into the diaphragm. We've all heard these phrases, and it can make breathing one of the most confusing parts of singing. And breathing really doesn't have to be that complicated. We tend to complicate it with all these different ideas and concepts when all of these things together can really add more tension to our singing rather than helping it. So today, I want to slow this conversation about the breath way down. In this video, we're going to talk about 3 very common breathing mistakes that singers make, how these mistakes happen, and how we can change them and fix them without panic or self-judgment. Now, before we get into the mistakes themselves, I want to name something really important here. Most breathing issues in singing are not technical failures, they are adaptive responses. Your body is always responding to something, and I feel like this is especially true when it comes to singing, whether we're responding to stress, anxiety, pressure, perfectionism. All of these things are impacting our voice and our breath. So if you recognize yourself in any of these mistakes that I'm naming today, I invite you to listen with curiosity and compassion, not criticism. Now, let's start with the mistake that I feel like most singers are familiar with. That mistake being breathing too high in the chest. And this kind of breath of breathing high into the chest is sometimes called clavicular breathing. Now, this usually looks or feels like a shallow breath where maybe the shoulders are rising up and we're breathing high into the chest, not really getting that low rib cage expansion, not getting much of that lateral expansion through the lungs and rib cage. Now, here's the thing about clavicular breathing. This isn't necessarily a bad habit per se. I feel like I often see this the most in beginner singers or younger singers that maybe aren't used to the kind of breathing that we do for singing. Because if we think about it, as we're moving about our day, we're not thinking about taking these low, expansive breaths, allowing the breath to fill up the belly and rib cage. Most of the time, as we're moving about our day, we're taking in these breaths that mostly exist in the chest. We're mostly doing this clavicular breathing. We also tend to experience this breath when we're maybe under stress or feeling anxious. And if we're honest with ourselves, there's a lot of things to be stressed and anxious about as we're moving about our day. Now, like I said before, clavicular breathing on its own is not a bad thing. I don't want us to overanalyze or micromanage our breathing as we're kind of moving about our day, because that can add extra stress. But where this kind of breathing can be problematic for singing is that this kind of breath is shallow. It doesn't allow for the kind of expansion through the rib cage and lungs that we need to take an expansive, deep breath, which is especially useful for longer phrases when we're singing. If we're taking this shallow clavicular breath, we're not going to have enough air for those longer phrases that we sing. And over the long term, of course, I mentioned that we tend to run out of air a lot faster when we engage with this clavicular breathing. But this kind of breathing can also lead to things like tension and strain, which we kind of want to let go of when it comes to our singing. Now, if you are watching or listening to this, it might sound like the answer is to take a really low, expansive breath, to really force the abdominals and the rib cage to expand on your inhale. Now, the truth is that if we go in the other direction, to the other extreme, and we're trying to really force this low belly breath, what that can lead to is other forms of tension. We can overfill the body. And truthfully, if we're singing pop, rock music, contemporary styles, we don't need a ton of breath on the inhale. We don't need to take these huge inhales. And in fact, that can lead to issues further down the road, which we'll actually talk about in a second. Now, what is the answer here? The answer lies in inviting width into your inhale. Don't try to force the abdominals to expand and invite in a ton of air on your inhale. I will sometimes give students the direction to fill up from the bottom up. So thinking about that expansion around the belly and through the rib cage. But with that direction, we are mostly thinking about width, expanding around the belly and through the rib cage, kind of with this 360-degree expansion in mind. So we're not just thinking about taking a low breath and forcing air into the belly, but we're thinking about expansion all the way around. Now, to do this, you can bring your hands to the base of your rib cage and take in a breath either through your nose or your mouth, focusing on getting this 360-degree expansion. So you breathe in, and you can even try a hiss on the exhale to practice this. Taking that hiss as far as it'll go. Doing this a few times, again, focusing on this 360-degree expansion. We're thinking less about forcing the breath in or gasping for air, but rather inviting the breath in and inviting this expansion in. Now, going off of this first mistake that I named of breathing too high in the chest, there's also the problem in our second mistake of taking in too much air. And I think that this one can surprise a lot of singers because, as we were talking about with the previous breathing mistake, we want to think about these expansive breaths, right? Getting that expansion through the lower body when we breathe in to sing. But as I mentioned, when we're breathing in, if we're thinking about filling up from the bottom up and getting that expansion through the belly and the rib cage, we want to think less about tanking up and taking in as much air as we can, and think more about expansion around, like that 360-degree expansion. But that does not mean we need to fill up all the way like we're filling up a balloon, because if we think about filling up a balloon, if we think about our body like this balloon shape, if we overfill a balloon, so if I have an actual balloon and I'm filling that up with air, if I overfill it, that can be a problem. Now, just as overfilling a balloon can be a problem, taking in too much air can be a problem for our voice, in that it can cause an issue for the vocal folds. With too much air to manage, it can be harder for the vocal folds to maintain consistent vibration and closure, which can result in a breathy tone when we're singing. Taking in too much air can not only cause a breathy tone when you're singing, especially when singing non-classical music, but it can create things like tension in the throat. I've also seen this manifest as singers maybe having leftover air at the end of a phrase. Like they finish a phrase and it's like there's a release or a little puff of air that happens after they finish. Now, like I said with the previous breathing mistake, This kind of technique, this kind of overfilling isn't a bad thing. It's just a habit that we've often developed in response to things like take in a deep breath. We've heard teachers and singers say things like that, and so we think, okay, I've got to tank up and take in as much air as possible in order to sing, when really that can cause more problems. Now, one way to think about this, one way to fix this, especially if you find that you're over breathing on your inhale, is to think about breathing in, but only breathing into about 80% of your total capacity for breath. Think about allowing the breath in rather than forcing it in. Another way that I like to work on this with students, especially if we're singing pop rock music or things that are non-classical, is I like to have the students speak the phrase. Because a lot of pop rock singing, especially if like maybe the verse or the chorus isn't super high, if we're not belting, for phrases that are more in our speaking voice range especially, I will have students speak the phrase first. So just talking through the phrase and then speaking the phrase in rhythm. So that way we're accounting for the duration of each word. And then I will have them notice, okay, how much air did it really take you to speak this phrase in rhythm with the duration of each word being appropriate and corresponding with the singing of the phrase. I will also give the cue to students to take a relaxed breath in, not tanking up, but breathing in with that 360-degree expansion, but in a way that feels calming, where you're not forcing it in, but you're allowing the breath in. And I think that that is my main point when it comes to this issue, is that we want to allow the breath in, not force it in. Now, the last mistake that I often see with singers as it relates to the breath is using too much air at the start of a phrase in a song. Now, this most often shows up if a singer is singing with a lot of breathiness when they start the phrase, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, maybe they're using a ton of volume and effort at the start of the phrase, and by the end of the phrase, they are completely out of air. They are struggling to reach the end because they've blown out all their air at the beginning. Now, I think a lot of this issue comes from singers feeling like they need to make a strong entrance, or maybe they want to really belt the phrase out and they feel like they need to use all this power, all this effort, and all this air at the start of the phrase. Now, while there is nothing wrong with wanting to sound strong, there's nothing wrong with belting, I do think that with different phrases, we need to be strategic. We can be strategic when it comes to our singing and our artistry, so that way we're getting across the emotions and the intensity that we want to get across without using up all our air at the beginning of the phrase. So what I like to have students do, what I like for them to think about, is I like to have them take the phrase that they're working on and find what is the most important part of this phrase. Is there a word? Are there a couple words that are really important that we want to make sure our audience hears? And we structure the breath and how much breath we're using around the climax, the highlight of the phrase. And a way that you can think about this is if the high point of your phrase, the phrase that you feel like is the most emotionally intense, if that is at the end of the phrase, it is a great idea to start the phrase a little bit softer, maybe more at speech level volume. So this volume that I'm talking to you with right now, I'm maybe going to start the phrase with this kind of volume and then gradually build up to the end of the phrase. Now, if the high point, the highlight of the phrase is in the middle of the phrase, maybe I'm going to start that phrase again at this speech level volume or just below speech level volume and get louder, bring more intensity to the middle of the phrase, and then maybe I back off to speech level volume by the end. These techniques that I'm sharing are not only great for our breath management, but they're also great for our storytelling. So you get a little added bonus there. So in short, I want you to think about the entire phrase, thinking about how you want to structure the phrase, what it is you want to highlight, what is the most important part of the phrase, and structure your breathing around that. All right, so I hope that you've learned something useful from watching or listening to this video. But if there's one thing that I hope you take away today, it's that breathing when it comes to singing isn't about control. It is about coordination, trust, and safety. Instead of asking, am I breathing correctly? I want you to ask yourself, what kind of breath can I take in, and how can I use my breath in a way that feels supportive of my artistry and expression? If any of this resonated with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. You can share in the comments which one of these resonated with you the most. And if you want support learning how to use your breath in your own singing, I would love to help. I offer private one-on-one lessons through my studio, and I also offer support to singers through my Curious Singer membership. You can check out those options in the show description. In the meantime, happy singing, y'all.